Hello, it's Silver. This is Wrath, Aeon of Ruin. So this is actually something that's been in early access and development for quite a while now. The original early access release was all the way back in 2019, and I actually played it back then as well and decided that I really just sort of wanted to wait on this one until it was complete because there were lots of other things to look at the time, and I just wanted to see what the complete vision would actually look like. So now that it's finally here and it is in fact launched 1.0 fully complete, it's time to take a look at it. So this is a neo-retro shooter, and the overall structure is pretty simple. Basically, you'll be plopped down into a hub. Every episode has its hub area, and this hub will have 5 different portals in it to 5 different levels. Now 5 might not seem like very many, but in this game the levels are very long and super expansive, so that's actually quite a lot of level to explore. And you can tackle these 5 levels in any order that you want. They're actually built in such a way that you don't have to do them in a specific prescribed order. You can just sort of wander around the hub and choose whichever ones you want. And once you get to the end of each of these levels, you'll gain a relic, and you simply go back to the hub area and place these 5 relics into this stone circle, which will then open up a portal to the final boss level of that episode. Beat the boss and you will end up in the next hub of the next episode. So it is a pretty simple structure, something that you've probably seen before. And the levels themselves also follow a relatively simple structure, despite actually being pretty complex and long. Mostly what you're looking at is the levels will have a sort of central area that has a bunch of doors locked by colored keys, and you will be going through various branches of the level, sometimes in a different order, in order to find these keys, and then returning to this sort of central area, which will usually then get repopulated with enemies, and then using the key on the doors to unlock more areas of the level, and so on until you finally get to the end. So because of how this works, this game is kind of easy to slip into a kind of a trance to, because a lot of the levels follow the same overall structure. Each level is pretty different from the last. They do have very different visual themes and different types of arenas and things, so they don't get samey exactly. It's just that there's a sort of a rhythm to the gameplay and to the overall sort of overarching level design, and it's easy to sort of start to feel comfortable with how everything is going to be laid out. Basically, once you've played a few levels in this game, you will get a really good idea of how the whole thing is going to go, and you'll be mostly correct. So, to get into the arsenal, this game's arsenal is actually pretty good, in my opinion. It's a little bit unusual in a couple of ways, in that it's sort of lacking some things that you're used to seeing, like, for instance, a rocket launcher, but it has some other really neat ideas, and overall I think the guns in this game are quite satisfying to use. They have good sound assets, they have good animations, and they have really nice feedback, so they feel pretty weighty. You'll start with your arm blade weapon, the Blade of Ruination, and this is your infinite ammo melee weapon that you'll always have with you just in case things go really bad and you run out of ammo for everything else. This is, of course, very short range, but it swings really fast, and you can get into a rhythm with running up to an enemy, slashing them, and running away again before they can hit you, and do this a couple of times until they fall. Kind of like the classic blood pitchfork dance. It's a similar idea. And it also has a secondary. All weapons in this game have a secondary, and the Blade's secondary is sort of a charge attack that allows you to rush forward, and it does quite a bit of damage to anything that's caught in the rush, but more importantly than that, it's also used for platforming and stuff, because you can use it in midair and it will actually propel you forward a lot farther than you could normally jump. There will be lots of sections of levels where you need to use this to traverse large gaps that you can't simply jump in between, and you'll get used to envisioning how far a gap has to be so that you can use this safely and not overshoot, but is also not normally jumpable. After a couple of levels, you'll sort of get the idea. In the first episode, you won't have to do this very much for level progression. There are lots of secrets in the first episode that you'll need this for, but as far as like actually getting through the levels themselves, you don't need to do it that much, but in episode 2 and 3, you have to do it a lot more often. You'll also get a revolver. This is a sort of unique triple-barreled revolver that the actual cylinder in the middle itself revolves per shot, which is sort of a neat effect, and it's really accurate. It does pretty solid damage, and its secondary fires all 3 barrels at once, although oddly the primary fire is hit scan and the secondary is not, so it's actually a little bit harder to hit things with the secondary since you have to lead your targets with projectiles that have travel time. I actually found the secondary to not be all that useful a lot of the times unless something is right up in your face, but usually in that case you want to be using the shotgun anyway. But the main primary fire of the revolver is still really useful for pretty much the entire game, honestly, because it's super accurate at even pretty long range, and it tends to take most things down in about 4 shots, at least on hard. I played through this game on the hardest difficulties to see what it was like, and I actually found it to be a pretty reasonable challenge most of the time. So all the footage that you're seeing in this video is of hard mode. And then you'll get your shotgun, and the shotgun in this game is a very good shotgun. This is sort of your workhorse weapon. You'll be using it all the time for the rest of the game, and it's just really powerful. It's a sort of long double-barreled shotgun, fires both barrels at once, so it uses 2 shotgun shells per trigger pull, but is really powerful and has a relatively deceptively long range, considering it's not a sawn-off. It is actually a full-length double barrel, so it's an effective weapon, and its secondary charges up a shot and fires these sort of round projectiles that fly forwards and sort of waver around in the air. They're not like pinpoint accurate, but they're relatively accurate, and then they sort of explode into a bouncing burst of shot wherever they land. And this is basically going to be your rocket launcher for the game. And I know that sounds kind of weird, but like I mentioned earlier, this game doesn't have a traditional rocket launcher, and in all of the situations that you would normally want to toss a rocket at something in a shooter like this, you're going to be using the shotgun secondary instead. So if you're looking at like a mid-range, tougher enemy that you need to get down quickly, or a large number of weaker enemies clustered together, stuff like that, you're going to be mostly using the shotgun secondary to take care of those. And then you get the Fang Thrower, which is your sort of rapid-fire projectile weapon. This is one of the more interesting points of the arsenal in that a couple of the weapons are sort of organic looking, and rather than just being made of metal, they actually look like they're sort of living things. Or rather that they were living things at one point before being made into weapons. And the Fang Thrower is a sort of double-barreled, fast-firing weapon that works a lot like the Super Nail Gun from Quake, and has a really similar sort of rhythm to it. It's just a useful weapon in general, although you'll find that you can't hold very much ammo for anything in this game. Pretty much all of your weapons have relatively low ammo max capacities, so you are going to be looking for ammo pretty much all the time because there's a lot of combat in this game. Most of the areas are full of arenas with tons of enemies in them, like hundreds of enemies per level, so it's tons of combat but very little ammo, and this means that you're going to be searching all the time, and some weapons suffer from this more than others. And the Fang Thrower suffers from this possibly the most because it's rapid fire, so it chews through its ammo really, really fast. And then there's the Retcher, which is your grenade launcher. Basically, it fires cysts, these explosive green acidic cysts, as weapons, and it sort of lobs them in an arc like a normal grenade launcher would. They have a pretty significant blast radius, like deceptively large for how the explosion looks, and they do really good damage, but you can also hurt yourself with it if you're not careful. If you hit an enemy with them, they explode on command, but if you hit the environment with them, they actually stick to places that they land, and they act as mines. And the secondary fire is a burst of 3 in rapid succession, which is useful for those big, tough, large enemies. And then eventually you'll find the slag cannon, which is sort of hard to describe, but it fires a pair of powerful but relatively slow-moving shots that have a small splash radius. And the ammo for this is very limited. You're not going to find a lot of it, but it does do really high single-target damage, and its secondary is a sort of explosive blast. Once you get to Episode 2, you'll find the Lance, which is my favorite weapon in the game. It's basically a railgun. It's pinpoint accurate, even at super long range, does really high damage, but it fires very slowly. Good for picking off very distant enemies or focusing on the really dangerous sort of heavies that you want to get out of the area right now. And its secondary is a shield that takes ammo in order to block projectiles. I actually didn't find the shield that useful until the final boss of Episode 2, at which point it became really useful. And then there's the Crystallizer. This is a little bit like your BFG kind of. It fires a bouncing purple beam that will refract across different enemies and do huge amounts of damage over time to them very rapidly. It's actually really ammo efficient. Despite ammo for it being very rare, it doesn't use it that quickly compared to how much damage it does. And its secondary will actually turn enemies permanently into crystal. And while an enemy is crystal, you can just hit them with anything to shatter them, or you can fire the primary beam at them and it will refract in different directions, and you can use it to sort of extend the beam's range and take out entire arenas worth of enemies with it that way. There's also one more weapon I haven't mentioned, but I'll leave that one to you to discover. In addition to all of your weapons, you'll also be picking up these things called relics, and these are basically like an evolution of the inventory system that we would see in games like Hexen. Some relics you'll find just chilling out in the open for you to go and grab. Some of them are in secrets, some of them are just like really high and out of the way and difficult to obtain, but regardless, they're all really useful. Pretty much you can just select them at any time by holding down the middle mouse button. It brings up a radial of all the relics that you've collected, and then you can just press R to use whichever one you have currently selected. They usually have very strong effects but don't last for very long, so they're all about finding the correct time in a big battle to use them. Their effects range from plopping down a stationary force field that deflects projectiles back at enemies, to one that just ups your damage across the board, one that lets you breathe underwater, one that spawns a very powerful but short-lived turret that fights with you. There's a black hole grenade that's super useful, and there's even one that makes you straight up invincible for a while, but it sets your health all the way down to 1. So by the time the invincibility wears off, you'll only have 1 HP left, so you gotta go and find some healing really quickly. You'll also sometimes, generally in secrets, come across these coffers, these locked chests, and exploring the levels you'll find coffer keys, and you can use any of these to unlock any of the coffers that you found. And they generally have some relics, some ammo, oftentimes some armor and stuff in them. There is an armor system that works exactly like armor in a traditional sort of retro FPS usually works, but there's an extra layer to this one because you can also rarely find dark armor, which looks cool and has its own separate gauge, and dark armor seems to act more like a sort of magic force field that gets depleted first, so it's really effective, but you don't find it that often. I think that the level design for the most part is really solid. The levels themselves are really large. Like I said, since there's only 5 of them, they tend to be really huge and have a lot of gameplay in each of them so that you're in them for a while. And they often have a structure of sort of long corridor slash platforming areas connecting large arenas where enemies will pop in and fight you whenever you get into the arena. The larger battles in this game are usually pretty huge because these arenas get really big, and there are also some levels where the arenas will repopulate when you go back to them and have another fight in them. Usually these, like I mentioned earlier, are the larger areas of a map where you have to return to several times because that's where all the key doors are. Also, of course, important is enemy variety, and there's a fair amount of enemy variety in this game. They at least have good silhouettes and stuff so that when they pop up you immediately know what they can do, and none of them look or sound similar to any of the other ones, so it's all obvious as to which enemies are what kind of threat, which is a good thing. But this kind of touches on one of the issues that I have with the game in general. It's sort of its overarching design principles. It has a couple of strange ideas that I'm not sure about. And one of the big ones is the pacing. The overall pacing of this game is kind of weird. Like I mentioned earlier that it's not uncommon for an area to repopulate once you return to it a second or third time with a key. Well, there's actually some levels where this happens like way too many times, and it makes the level kind of a slog to get through. I remember one level in particular that when you get the red key, you return to an area, and it lets you get like 10 feet in front of the red key door, and then it spawns a whole bunch of enemies. So, you know, you expected that, you go and you beat all the enemies, and then you go back to the door, and it lets you get to the exact same spot as before, and then it spawns a second wave of enemies, and it does this 4 times in the same area, 4 times in a row, before it finally lets you go through the red door. And that just feels like too much. Like the first one is an expected fight that you're ready for. The second one is a little bit of a subversion of expectations, but the other 2 just seem unnecessary. And this is sort of a problem with a lot of the levels in the game, I feel. By the time you get to the end, and of course there is usually a sort of climactic battle towards the end of the level to finish things off, it feels less like a big triumphant battle and more like kind of a slog because of what you fought through. And this is also partially because it often throws these very large walls of enemies at you without a chance for you to rearm or heal yourself. And in the first episode, this means you are constantly out of ammo. Like, all the time, it feels like you have basically no ammo and you have to really scrounge. And by the time of the second episode, when you have all the weapons so that you can spread out your ammo usage a little bit more efficiently, it's not as big of a deal, and running out of ammo isn't so much of a problem anymore, but it does mean that the first episode has a weird bit of balance to it, where it feels like you're nearly constantly running out of ammo for everything. And this pacing issue also continues into other aspects of the game, like for instance the weapons. It gives you almost all of the weapons in the game in the first episode, so that for the rest of the entire game there are only like 3 more weapons that it hasn't given you. So it kind of, I guess, like it sort of blows its load a little bit early, and then you just don't have enough variety, I guess you could say, because you have almost the entire arsenal from the start of the game, and it doesn't have a lot of cool new stuff to reward you with after that, because it gives you so much so early. And the same thing happens with the enemies. It gives you a ton of the enemy variations early on, and so for the rest of the game, there are only a couple of more enemy types for the entire experience that it has left to actually introduce. So it sort of feels like the game introduces far too much stuff in the first episode, to the point that for the second and third episodes, it doesn't really have a lot left new to show you anymore. You run into a situation where once you've played through the first episode, you've kind of seen almost every trick the game has to offer, and it's not going to change much after that point. The game also has a bit of a weird movement system. So in normal retro shooters, the idea is when you press a movement direction, you start moving slowly, and then the longer you hold the button down, the faster you move until you reach your full speed. It's a really fast ramp up, like it doesn't take very long to get up to full speed because these games are usually very fast, but there still is a ramp up. You don't immediately start at full blast. However, in this game you do. So all you got to do is just barely tap a direction and you will fling yourself violently in that direction at full speed. This means that you never fully feel like you're in control of your character, because just trying to tap one of the movement keys to get around a corner a little bit or to inch up to an edge or something like that, you feel like you just throw yourself over them immediately, because there is no way to just move a little bit in this game. You're either moving at full speed instantly or not at all. This also extends to the jumping of the game, where you don't have a lot of air control, which is a little bit strange feeling because you move so fast on land. It feels like you should have a lot of control in the air, but once you leave the ground, you don't actually have very much control of your character at all. However, it feels like you have a sort of, the best way I can describe it is like a capsule-shaped hitbox where your feet should be. Like your feet are like a rounded ballpoint pen shape, and instead of just like landing on ledges, you kind of slide around a little bit, like you can't fully get over the edge. Instead of having a nice square hitbox where you simply land on something, it's like a rounded edge where you always slide off. It feels kind of bizarre, but you'll find it happens all the time in battle and stuff. You'll be holding forward, just holding W and jump up to a ledge, and you'll like slide to the left despite the fact that you're not holding left, and you'll slide all around this way just because of how the jumping works. It's a very strange feeling, but it means that you will get hit oftentimes when you're trying to get up to certain ledges in combat and stuff, because you never really have an easy time jumping up to places. You can crouch jump, but it doesn't feel like a very good crouch jump. It feels like you have to do it because of how wonky the jumping physics are, rather than because the game was designed around having this option. So overall, I would say that I enjoyed my time with Wrath more than I didn't. It has some fun weapons and some fun levels. It's got good enemy variety, even though it introduces it all too quickly. It's got good weapons, and it does the same thing to those. It's just that it's got some weird design decisions that make me not fully appreciate everything it's going for. Like, it's a solid attempt at the genre, but it's got some weird pacing issues and some control issues that hold it back a little bit from being truly great. If you've played a lot of neo-retro shooters and you're in the mood for more, then you could do a lot worse than trying out Wrath, but I also feel that it is definitely not one that stands out of the pack. You know what I mean? Like, this is a common genre now. There are lots and lots of games in this genre, and it's getting harder to stand out. And this one, I don't really think, for me at least, does stand out in any specific way that says you must play this because of this reason. It's just kind of fine, you know, it's average, it's okay. And to be fair, being okay is still a good thing in a genre with this many entries. It's just that it doesn't do anything that makes it stand on the shoulders of anything else. So I'll put the link in the description below this video to the Steam store page for Wrath if you wish to go and check it out yourselves. Thank you guys very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.